Enter South Street Library, 4th grade. Susan's class arrived first, walking in with orderly energy. "Go ahead," she said, waving them toward the tables. "Remember what you're allowed to buy." They nodded and immediately scattered, but in a controlled way, flipping through chapter books, comparing bookmarks, testing out pencils by tapping them on the table. Margaret opened the register. Next. The third kid was still deciding between 2 erasers and kept switching them back and forth like the erasers were going to reveal the answer. Susan floated between them, redirecting gently. "If you're not buying it, put it back where you found it." Then Craig's class arrived, his 5 kids bursting in with a little more energy, a little less order, but still manageable. "All right," Craig said, clapping his hands once. "Remember your budgets, and don't spin the poster rack." Now 10 kids were in the room, and the energy doubled instantly. They tore through the novelty pencils and knocked over a cup of gel pens. Someone tried to hand Margaret $1 that had clearly been in a sweaty pocket since breakfast. Craig crouched beside a kid holding 2 books. "You've got $5. Pick one. You can get the other one tomorrow." Don stepped inside moments later, surveying the room, doing his little walk. "Looks good in here," he said. Margaret immediately straightened a little, softening her voice. "It's going really well. They're doing great." Craig nodded at Don, still crouched beside a kid comparing erasers. "Busy day." Susan gave Don a smile. "They're excited." Don scanned the tables, the kids, the counter. "Everything running smoothly?" "Oh, yes," Margaret said, warm. "Very smooth." She rang up another sale, sliding a bookmark into a paper bag. The last few 4th graders trickled up to the counter, one with exact change, one with a 5, one still deciding between 2 bookmarks like it was a life choice. Margaret rang through them quickly, sending them back towards Susan and Craig. Susan clapped her hands once. "All right, line up. Let's head back." Craig herded his group toward the door, gently redirecting a kid who was still trying to spin the poster rack on the way out. "Nope, tomorrow." The kids filed out in a loose, chatty line, comparing what they bought, waving pencils around, showing off the bookmarks like trading cards. Don lingered near the chapter book table, hands in his pockets, watching the room settle. The tables were messy, but nothing alarming. Just purchase day chaos. Margaret glanced at Don, then at the cash drawer, then back at him. "Don," she said, softening her voice. "Can I ask you for a favor?" He straightened a little. "Sure." She opened the drawer again, the bills already starting to pile in uneven stacks. "Since you're here, would you mind giving me a hand with this? Just a quick count before the next group comes in." Don stepped in right beside her. "Yeah, sure." They sorted the bills together, working in an easy rhythm. It felt like the kind of help he should have been giving all along. When they finished, she slid the drawer shut and hesitated just long enough for him to look up. "Actually," she said, lowering her voice a little, "would it be all right if I kept the money in your office for the rest of the day? Just so it's out of the way. And out of sight." Don nodded immediately. "Yeah, I can lock it up. Nobody will touch it." She gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you. That makes me feel a lot better." He shrugged like it was nothing. "Happy to help." She wiped her hands on her cardigan, glanced at the tables, and then back at him. "And if you're not in a rush later, I could use an extra set of hands after the last group. Resetting the tables, quick cleanup, maybe a little inventory before tomorrow." "Yeah," he said, without hesitation. "I can stay." She nodded, relieved. "Perfect. And at the end of the day, maybe we can take a little look at the cameras together, just to make sure everything lines up before the final day." "Of course," he said. "We'll go through it." Margaret let out a breath she'd been holding since the morning rush. "You're the best, Don." He smiled, a little flustered. "Just doing my job." Enter South Street Library, 5th grade. Tanya's class showed up first, 10 kids trailing behind her in a messy line. Half of them were still finishing conversations from the playground. One kid was dribbling a basketball until Tanya took it with a single look. "Inside," she said, holding the door. "Walk, please." The moment they crossed the threshold, the energy shifted. 10 kids fanning out toward the tables, eyes already scanning the pencils, the posters, the erasers shaped like food. A couple of them whispered to each other like they had a plan. They didn't. They were just 5th graders. Margaret opened the register, and Don stood there like a bystander, taking up space by the counter. A minute later, Cara's class rounded the corner. 13 kids, all talking at once, all waving money, all convinced they needed to be first. Cara was juggling a stack of permission slips and redirecting 2 boys who were trying to race each other into the library. "Slow down," she said, breathless. You're not beating anyone. Just go. Kids crowded the novelty pencils. Someone spun the poster rack too hard. Someone else dropped a handful of coins that rolled in every direction. Margaret braced herself behind the counter. And then, Michelle's class arrived. 8 kids, calmer, more collected, but still 5th graders with recess energy humming under their skin. Michelle held the door. Inside, eyes on tables, not each other. Her 8 kids joined the crowd, filling every aisle, every corner around the displays. Now 31 5th graders were in the library. The room vibrated with it. Don stayed near the chapter book table, hands in his pockets, watching the waves settle. Margaret took a breath and tapped the register. All right, she said. Next. A kid stepped up with a 10 and a poster tube. Another kid had a Ziploc bag of coins that clinked like gravel. Behind her, the table shook under the weight of 5th grade energy. Pencils sideways, erasers scattered, bookmarks mixed up. The kids talking over each other. Tanya crouched beside a kid holding 2 chapter books. You've got $8. Pick one. Cara resurrected a girl trying to buy a hardcover with 3 singles. Nope, paperback section. Michelle floated behind her 8, keeping them from knocking over the gel pens again. Don drifted closer to the counter, watching the line wobble and reform every few seconds. You good? He asked. Margaret nodded, smoothing out a crumpled bill. I'm fine. They're just 5th graders. He smiled. Yeah, they come in hot. Don leaned in a little. Want me to help bag? She didn't even look up. If you don't mind. Grabbed a stack of paper bags and started sliding purchases into them, whatever Margaret rang through. He wasn't fast, but he was steady, and it kept the line from collapsing. Next, Margaret said. Coins clinked. Bills fluttered. Kids compared what they bought like they were trading cards. By the time the last kid paid, the room looked like it had survived a small storm, but the counter was clear and the drawer was balanced enough for now. The teachers clapped their hands. All right, back to recess, Tanya called. Let's go, Cara echoed. Michelle herded her group toward the door. The kids filed out, waving their purchases, comparing who got what, still buzzing with recess energy. The door swung shut behind them. The library finally went quiet after the 5th graders cleared out, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Margaret stood in the middle of the room, hands on her hips, taking in the wreckage. She started with the novelty pencils, sorting them back into her cups. She didn't bother making them perfect. She just made them look like they hadn't been through a hurricane. Then the bookmarks. She flipped through them, straightened the stacks, put the bent ones aside. Chapter books back into their display. Erasers went back into their bins. Don stayed nearby, giving her space, but not leaving. He picked up the stray pencils, righted a few books, and steadied the poster rack again. You don't have to do all of it tonight, he said. Margaret shook her head. If I don't, tomorrow's going to be worse. He didn't argue. He just kept helping. By the time they finished, the room looked like a book fair again, ready for the final day tomorrow. Once the tables were reset, Margaret pulled out the clipboard from behind the counter, the one with the half-filled inventory sheets. Day 2, South Street Library. Inventory with Dawn. Okay, she said, exhaling. Let's see what we've got left. Dawn came around the counter, standing close enough to help but not crowd her. He held the sheet while she counted. Margaret flipped to the next page on the clipboard, the page already creased from being handled all day. Let's start with pencils. Dawn scanned the cups. Looks like maybe 60, 65? She checked the sheet. We started with 120. Sold maybe 30-ish today. She frowned. Okay, that's close enough. She marked it down. Bookmarks next, she said. Dawn flipped through the stacks. Still a lot. Maybe 80? 90? Margaret checked the sheet again. We started with 150. Sold maybe 20. She wrote it down. Erasers? Dawn crouched, checking the bins. These are lower. Maybe 40? 45? Margaret blinked. We had 100, she checked her notes, and I only sold maybe 15 today. She frowned again, but didn't say anything yet. Okay, she murmured. Next, funny little gadgets. Dawn moved to the novelty table. Spy pens? She asked. He picked one up. 6 left. We ordered 20, she said under her breath. Fun highlighters? He counted. 10. Started with 25, she murmured. Stamps? 7. Scissors with the squiggly lines? 4. Scented stationery? Half a box. Fidget toys? Down to maybe 12. Chocolate bar rulers? 3. Vinyl stickers? He flipped through the sheets. Maybe 25? Phone erasers? He held at the bin. 5. Margaret stared at the clipboard. She went back to the erasers, bookmarks, pencils, and counted again. She checked the original order sheet she tucked behind the clipboard. The numbers still didn't line up. She tried recounting the erasers, bookmarks, and pencils again. Still wrong. She pressed her lips together, set the clipboard down, and rubbed her forehead. Something's off, she said quietly. Dawn looked up. What do you mean? She tapped the eraser bin. I didn't sell this many. Not even close. These numbers don't make sense. So either you can't count, or maybe I fucked up. Dawn straightened. Want me to recount? No, she said, already reaching for her computer. I want to look at the cameras. He nodded once. All right, he said. Let's pull up the footage from this morning. Margaret clicked into the security system, her stomach tightening as the first thumbnail loaded. She pulled up the first camera, the wide shot of the library floor. Kids from Hillary's class spilled in, loud and excited, the tables shaking under their hands. Margaret watched herself behind the counter, ringing up purchases, smiling, and smoothing out bills. Nothing unusual, and then she clicked ahead. The boys slipped out behind the tall nonfiction shelf. Margaret leaned in a little, pointing to the screen. There, she said quietly. Dawn nodded once. Yeah, go back a few seconds. She played it again. The 3 boys ducked behind the shelf, glancing over their shoulders to make sure the coast was clear. The third reached for something on the display table and then disappeared behind the shelf with it. Margaret's stomach tightened. She clicked to the next angle. The boys moved fast, hands going into pockets, sleeves, hoodies. Margaret didn't say anything yet. She just watched. Dawn stayed quiet too, jaw tightening slightly, but he didn't comment. He let her take it in at her own pace. She clicked ahead to the 4th grade footage. Nothing, just normal chaos. Then 5th grade. Kids everywhere, hands everywhere, teachers redirecting, Margaret ringing up purchases, Dawn bagging items. The morning footage was enough. Margaret sat back in the chair, exhaling slowly. Well, she said, voice low. That explains the numbers. Dawn nodded. Yeah. She rubbed her forehead with the heel of her hand. I knew something was off. I just didn't think it was this. Dawn didn't tell her what to do. He just said, We'll handle it tomorrow. Don't say anything yet. Margaret nodded, closing the footage window. Yeah, tomorrow. She shut down the monitor, the screen going dark. Tomorrow was the final day, open from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Teachers coming in and out. But now she knew what she was walking into.